So today we're going to be talking about the book Transport for Humans, and I hope to give you an overview of the argument. We're going to discuss setting up why there's a problem to be solved. Then following the structure of the book that starts in that same vein, we're then going to go into principles of psychology that relate to the transport experience. So when people are choosing to travel, and that's distinct from what we'll then go into, which is the psychology of transport design. So when people are tasked with designing transport systems, what biases they tend to form, the way that system works, and ultimately I want to finish with the reflections on applying social and behavioural sciences within the transport sector. Trying to take stock of some of the experience I've been fortunate enough to have when I was at Department of Transport, the ability to see what other transport operators and countries are doing, and take stock of the good, the bad, and the not so good. So the key argument of Transport for Humans, I think, follows something like this, that transport as a sector has, for good reason, started with engineering and efficiency metrics and needed to measure what it can, but it's now got to a point where it's optimized as far as it can on the things that we know we can measure in quantifiable terms: speed, time, and to some extent cost. But it's now needs to rebalance its approach to include factors that understand people's ability to choose travel, their own capabilities when traveling, and the way in which we can factor in more qualitative aspects of people's experience. A shorthand for this would be a phenomenology, but we might get into that detail a little bit later. Personally, I'm really passionate about travel and transport for the great opportunities that it brings to people, the life opportunities that it brings, the way connectivity is really important, I've seen throughout my life, but also the way in which it's not just an instrumental, or like there's not just a purpose or a function to travel. The experience of doing it has some significance. And that's where I think this book was born from. Yes, the observation that the sector is lags behind others in our world in being reliant on quantifiable metrics. But actually, there's a phenomenal power of mobility and transport that's being left undiscovered. And without getting into too much detail, something like a high-speed railway that connects the UK, if we can agree on anything, it's that it's been very difficult to understand or quantify or model and understand what the values and the benefits of that kind of infrastructure would be. And some of the reasons it's stumbled along the way is the challenge that it's had in justifying its existence. But I think with a more human or a more societal approach, we're going to get a lot better at understanding this in the future. So to reflect on why this book is here, historically, the way my co-author Rory and I have seen it is that mobility and transport has been in a bit of you can simplify it into a battle of two ideologies. On the one hand, the utilitarians have come across, be that in engineering and economics, that often suit those disciplines, and have said, right, we need to optimize journey against metrics that we can measure. And that will include speed and cost and time, but it will also relate to transport equity and inequality, and that will do the thing that makes what we can say is the biggest net difference. That ideology often leads us to more aggregate or abstracted ways of seeing things, versus historically a more romantic or nostalgic view of travel, which has been more anecdotal or more experiential in recounting those joys and the pains of travel. That's useful, but has so far sometimes lacked substance, or lacked that ideology has butted up against the utilitarian view, which is sort of exemplified by sort of I see data or nothing else. I feel like this century there needs to be there needs a middle way, and transport for humans, or a social and behavioral science approach, can start adding rigor to the romantic view of what it is to travel, and the peculiar ways in which people choose and have abilities to travel. And it can also offer a valuable critique to an otherwise very dominant utilitarian view, which can often leave, as critics of all utilitarian things will see it, can leave some people out of the equation. In preparing for this talk today, I thought it would be useful to reflect on some of the beyond transport influences that I think Rory and I, when writing this book, put together. And one text that I was surprised that he and I coalesced on was the one on the left here, James C. Scott's book, Seeing Like a State. I say surprised because my original degree was in geography, and this book came up in the context of colonialism and the ways in which governments articulated power in the colonies. Rory, who works in the advertising sector, actually read classics as an original degree, saw Seeing Like a State from a different angle, and saw it more from the view in a business sense of the way in which governments and large organisations tend to have to view the world in a certain way. And Scott's argument, if I might sum it up, is that the state tries to make legible, tries to understand people and all these complexities by making certain simplifications, by putting people in particular categories or in particular uniform standard measures. And they make those simplifications because they're now dealing with thousands or millions or billions of people. But he's making the argument that some of these, almost the book cover shows, you need to draw straight lines. You need to make the state has made simplifications that then sets it up for failure. The second book that I thought I would share that has been a significant influence on our work was that there could have been other texts here, but Lewis Mumford's Technics and Civilization, which is a category of science and technology studies that relate and bring this wider view of mobility to look at the other technologies that affect our lives. So there are some domestic technologies that within our homes that have transformed the way we live our lives, from the washing machine to the light bulb. But then there are also significant transport technologies, and Mumford's work has been applied in a transport setting to this idea of the sort of travel time constant, that if you look over time, people have a certain diet and the length of time that they travel in a day. Broadly, it's been described as about an hour, and that's been consistent over a long time. It's starting to change a little bit in this century. But it's a really, really interesting critique and really captured our imagination around the way in which it's not just about reductions in travel time are not now and have never been thought to be the radical thing that we're moving towards, which is a challenging view, and sort of says even if we were to move towards a world of teleportation, we'd still have transport challenges. And then thirdly, and I think probably more obviously, is the work that's done in social and behavioral sciences. Here is Daniel Kahneman's Thinking Fast and Slow, but there are many other important works from psychologists that are then getting into the people aspect and what it is to experience things. So I suppose these three texts sum up our view of the inclination to abstract things, the cross-cutting influence of technology on mobility, and thirdly, the nature of and the limits of people's psychological experience. This is all quite high level, I appreciate, so I want to now bring it into what I think the book's first, and what from feedback I've received, key argument that people have picked up on is simply saying, let's agree a starting point. People are not cargo. Yet many transport policies and technologies treat people as though they follow very simple cargo-like rules, as though the main mission of transport is to simply get people from A to B. Being treated like cargo has a number of problems and is the main justification for why it's vital that we move towards a system that is more humane or more human friendly. So when people travel, we give them names. People go by many names: customers, drivers, passengers, road users, wheelchair users, cyclists. What we all have in common is we're all human. And the nature of being human is that we have a range of needs and desires. Now, one of the most important justifications, I think, for transport for humans, before we get into any of the objectives that you might be working on, from sustainability to transport viability or new business models or what have you, is simply an aspect that comes from the morals of dignity and of respect. That I think that the data show people spend hours and hours of their year traveling. They have to invest very large proportions of their available disposable income on transport. They just deserve to be treated respectfully, with dignity, and it's an important part of anyone's life. We could then layer that up for a rationale to also be we should treat people more humanely because it makes good business sense, because economies and societies function better when people have good mobility. And then there are the clear arguments to say a move towards a more sustainable world will require a world where the intention is not necessarily that people travel further and further, faster and faster, inexorably, partly because we come up against the laws of physics. So our key argument is to say, for a long time, we readily designed things understanding the nature of our human bodies and the way that they move. We now need to move to understanding people's mentality and their experience when they travel. To use a quip, we're using a Stone Age brain in a high-speed world. So what we need are transport systems to be built around us rather than us trying to fit into transport systems. In the book itself, in its introduction, we introduce a character to exemplify this and hope to build on the important work that's been done in economics of that. So we say that when people travel, we're Homo sapiens, and we should understand the nature of our species, what it is to be human. But unfortunately, there's a character called Homo transporticus, which builds on that work of economic man, of Homo economicus, where when people have designed transport systems, they've needed to simplify, or they just have simplified. Either they haven't had the evidence, or they've just willfully simplified people's behaviour into a set of things like people will prioritise the faster journey over the slower journey, like that we should show certain metrics over others. Homo transporticus is like economic man, but in a transport space. So it makes the unfortunate assumption that people know where they are the whole time. They know all the routes that are available to them. They understand the pricing and tariff of things. They understand, say, the cost of car ownership, which has been shown to be actually quite hard for people to evaluate, given the way costs stack up on each other when you move into that. That time is perceived the same way whether you're going out to a journey or back from a journey. That the journey length is perceived the same time whether you're in a good mood or a bad mood, so on and so forth. So a really important way in which we can have a framework to then say, what are the assumptions we're making, how valid are they, and how can they be updated? I think that's a lot of setup and theory, so I thought it would be fun and I think also instructive to move into a quiz or something that's a bit more experiential to bring some of this to life. So if you entertain a few questions, 3 questions all in all, I promise the most interesting part of this is the way in which we can discuss or debate the answers. So I don't think pens and paper are needed at the ready, but let's go through them. Feel free in the chat to give your responses if you'd like. So question 1 is typical of a psychologist to put a visual illusion on the screen. I pose the question, which square is a lighter shade of grey? Is it the square marked A or the square marked B? I'm pausing, but I suspect many of you don't need more than 2 seconds to come up with your answer. And I've seen this many, many times, and I would still be inclined to give the answer B, being the lightest shade of grey. But the strange thing is, they're in fact exactly the same shade of grey. It's an interesting visual illusion, and it's a consequence of 2 main factors. One, we have this green cylinder casting a shadow over the square, and the way our eyes work is we've seen shadows before, and we upweight what we see in context to be lighter than it is. And secondly, a principle of opposing luminescence gradients, which means, again, we've seen checkerboards before, and we look to adjacent squares for cues. So this has been cleverly done so that it harnesses those. But the peculiar thing is when you take the context away, you see it quite differently. And having presented this many times before, I know that I can talk about those 2 principles all I like, but people will say seeing is believing, and they'll say I don't believe you. You can talk about theory all you like, and that's why I think it's instructive to show and not just tell or not just say things. So as we start to remove some of the context, they might look like they converge now, and now I'm very confident they've converged and they look like the same shade of grey. Some visual illusions work that you can sort of switch them on and off, or once you've seen it one way, it doesn't go back the other way. This is a peculiar one where when the context comes back, you can't really unsee it. As you see, the author of this study from MIT 20 years ago found that people systematically and always see it this way. It doesn't matter what you do. And the point of showing this in the context of a talk that's ostensibly about transport and transport geography is to say it shines the light immediately on the way in which the way we perceive the world is not, it's just fundamentally not about perfect accuracy or about exact measurements of light, for instance. So our visual system is not nearly say designed. Our visual system is not adapted to see reality. It's adapted to see what's useful to us, and that I could show other illusions or other things that are not just peculiarities or edge cases with respect to hearing or taste or temperature or perception of time. In none of these cases are we perfect meters. We design equipment that might be able to measure that, but that is not our experience, and that we wouldn't even want that to be our experience, because we would have died out a long time in the past, and also functionally it's not what's helpful to us in the present. Question 2 is much more practical and to be expected, but I think shines a different light on how people experience a transport system. It's a question that leverages some good data from Transport for London. So if you'll entertain a simplification, which London Underground route would you take between Liverpool Street and Victoria? I used to live in East London, very close to Liverpool Street. I happen to be very close to Victoria today, so it's on my mind. If you're familiar with the London Tube, then you might be trying to think about the tube map, which is sort of blurred out here. Otherwise, you might be thinking about the different ways in which you could take different options. Many people would, you see, there are different assumptions that people might have made. And before I've revealed the answer, the challenge has been one of data, that the London Underground has been famous for its early adoption of contactless ticketing, effectively, the Oyster card that let you tap in and out at the barriers. But until relatively recently, no one really knew about how people travelled within the network, but for asking them. You could see data of tapping in at Liverpool Street and tapping out of Victoria, but what happened elsewhere was never known. That changed through the use of Wi-Fi technology that could monitor a subset of people whose phones would connect to the Wi-Fi routers in the corridors and the platforms, and reveal for the first time how people travel. And it's a good example of how much an improvement in data can show, but also in what it can't. So, to reveal some of those answers, it was of the devices that could be identified for the journey, 44% of them took what was the known as the fastest route, changing at Oxford Circus, so taking the central line, the red central line, changing through some escalators and then changing at Victoria. That would be the fastest route by about 3 minutes or 4 minutes quicker than the yellow route in the top right, which is the circle line, which about a quarter of people took. That route requires no interchanges. It has walk-through carriages, air conditioned. The length of steps is a little bit shorter, but it doesn't come as frequently. And then there are some interesting edge cases that you'll see at the base there, where people seemingly have gone the wrong way, but 1 or 2% of people have found themselves going in what seems to be the wrong direction, but maybe it worked for them. In the other case of people changing multiple times. Now, what this can be instructive about is how much we can learn from new aspects of data, but how much we can't. So we know nothing of people's preferences here. We don't understand whether this is the same person habitually makes the same trip, or whether they do this on a different occasion. So they might have priorities of punctuality or of reliability or of an easy journey where they get a seat. So we don't know about what the literature would normally call people's biases, and it even gets us to question whether it's legitimate to talk about someone having a bias towards comfort or a bias towards punctuality. For me, they're more priorities. And finally, it shows that people are not cargo. To reinforce the earlier point, people have agency, and people are actively choosing different trips, whether we like it or not. On a note about what it doesn't show all the people that didn't make that trip because it wasn't accessible, or it wasn't affordable, or it wasn't safe enough for them. It obviously doesn't show all the people that might have walked or cycled or taken a taxi and so forth. But I think on screen now you get an important rather sense of the differences you might make if you were unable to use escalators to change, and in fact the inequity that people face were they to require step-free access, they would be at Liverpool Street, not boarding the Central Line or the Circle Line. They would need to take a bus to London Bridge, take two different tube lines. It would take them nearly twice as long and cost them nearly twice as much. The third question is one that's much more pointed at transport design, and I'll pose this quickly. Imagine you're in a situation in which 2 road improvement plans are available, but there's only budget to build one. Both of the proposed roads are the same length, 20 kilometres, and they're being evaluated for their potential to reduce journey times as much as possible. Now, would you choose Road A, which increases the average speed from 40 to 50 kilometres an hour, or would you choose Road B, that increases the average speed from 80 kilometres per hour to 130 kilometres an hour? Now, remember, in this simplification, your task is to reduce total journey times by as much as possible. I would be inclined to answer Road B, because it feels like we're increasing the speeds the most. But what are the different options that are available? Well, this has been studied experimentally, and research finds that 4 in 5 people would choose road B, irrespective of their background, and it's been tested in among transport professionals and taxi drivers actually as well. But it's road A that actually saves more time. So that road that was going from a very slow speed to a slow speed to a slightly less slow speed. And you see that graphed in the left-hand part of the screen here. So if we 40 kilometre an hour trip took 30 minutes, and by increasing that speed 50 kilometres an hour, we make it 10 minutes shorter. Whereas the 80 kilometre an hour trip on road B was already fast at 15 minutes, and making it a lot faster, all the way up to 130 kilometres an hour, nearly doubled the speed. Saves just 9 minutes. And the reason for that is called the proportion heuristic, that when we're making estimates of time and speed, we're inclined to take the proportional change between them. And it takes some head scratching to understand why this is even a riddle or a puzzle at all. And I'll get into that on the next slide. Just as a side note, but also relevant to this, is that in doing so, you've increased the energy consumption through aerodynamic drag here dramatically. The first one was up by increased it by about 50%, and the last one by 200%. And I think I'm just trying to make this side point that as we make things faster and faster, there are laws of physics that mean energy involved gets higher and higher, sort of exponentially. And it's that exponential curve that actually is the reason for our mental agility here. The proportion heuristic takes the metric, which is miles per hour, or in this case, kilometers per hour, and assumes that there's a straight line relationship between making that speed, the proxy we have for velocity, which is miles per hour, and thinking it as a straight line, when in fact time savings work on a curvilinear relationship. The way in which you get around that phenomena is actually simply giving it a new metric, and that's the purpose of my sharing this this third and final question. That the metrics we choose fundamentally are shaping our perception of things. So in here, the insight is the proportion heuristic. The idea, or the perceptual solution, is the paceometer, for which 2 academics in Israel proposed. And you'll see that dial in the inside is a familiar miles per hour. But if you express it the other way around, as minutes per, in this case, 10 miles, then you'll see how going faster and faster saves you less and less time in miles over your journey. And I'm not necessarily proposing that all vehicles need to be fitted with these new paceometer speedometers, but it is instructive to see how the metrics we're choosing are shaping our perception, as I said, but also how new technologies might come over the top. So people with GPS and sat-nav often find that they don't really make much headway into reducing their arrival time by going faster on the motorways, but they see they hemorrhage time whenever they're in traffic, and that's consistent with the fact that your speed is going to decrease at these lower areas. So I'll now share some quick points that I hope to rattle through. The first instructive lesson from the book, in its middle section about transport experience, is the importance to then design for reality and perception. So this is not to deny should never improve connectivity and never make things faster or cheaper. Those things should all happen, and engineering and economics are important disciplines to make that happen. But we should also be attentive to people's perceptual experience and understand how it feels when traveling. So it's a crying shame to improve punctuality if people don't know that punctuality has increased because you haven't communicated it. Or it's a great shame to run a service very reliably, but the problem is nobody's told the arrival time, and then sit with some anxiety or doubt, not sure where they are or when it'll arrive, because we know people's perception of time depends upon their mood state. To build some examples on this point, so what would it look like to account for perception as well as reality? Well, live timings are a very literal way of interpreting that from live passenger information at bus stops, be that in the UK with live departure display boards, or shown here on screen in the Netherlands, a more low-key solar-powered version that shows them at smaller level bus stops. Some of those ideas can relate to the fact that if people don't know where bus routes are going or where they're coming from, then in Brighton they find that putting the route on the side of the bus significantly increases ridership, particularly among people who otherwise have access to a car, who otherwise the bus is not salient, and they might not know. They might know its ultimate destination, which is far outside of the city or as the bus depot. But they don't know the significant stops at that, say, number 7 bus is going along the way. Some really exciting work has been done in the UK. A couple other countries have this on their electric vehicle number plates, but as a way of accelerating EV adoption, putting a green number plate on it builds on the social insight that people are attentive to how a technology is being adopted, how popular it is, and how it's being used. And finally, in the case of some infrastructure in London with the Elizabeth line, which has very recently been upgraded to have data connectivity. And this digital and physical infrastructure point, I think, is going to be really, really significant as those two technologies overlap. The requirement to be connected at all times, or the nature of the use and worthwhileness of travel time being predicated upon being able to receive a phone call or plan your route along the way, or give people urgent information while they're traveling. When we're looking about perception and people's experience of things, I'll highlight a piece of work that I think exemplifies a strong approach up in Liverpool with the new Merseyrail rolling stock. People and communities were consulted right from the start from everything, of all of the details, from the seat design to the where the CCTV would be displayed, to the nature of power sockets, the livery on the outside, and that design process has an important power. And some of that power is in actually value and pride in local infrastructure. The second point to make is that when we design transport systems, sometimes they are very intuitive and very logical and easy to understand, that it would be an obvious benefit to make a journey a little bit quicker. And that might explain some of why those kind of schemes are particularly popular or easy to sell in or easy to model. But some transport policies are counterintuitive, and they warrant some special attention. And I think the 3 examples I'll describe probably explain that, which is the nature of, say, on the right-hand side, a smart motorway involves slowing things down in order to speed up overall traffic, which doesn't make sense in a sort of a lay sense of that term. But of course, we know that it has a potential to reduce incidents, make the journeys more punctual, allow traffic to travel a little bit closer together, and so on. Likewise, the description of a low traffic neighborhood feels counterintuitive, that closing a road would reduce the amount of congestion. So these become contested topics, whereby when they don't have accompanying evidence. And the reason that I wanted share this as an important point, is that transport designers are typically the people closest to the topic at hand. They'll be fluent in the evidence, sometimes for years and years, without challenge. But when it comes into contact with society, it can be understood in different ways. So this is a plea to accompany infrastructure changes with communications and public engagement. Thirdly, I think I've got a lot on here, but I'll cover it. A point that's made in the book that I found myself coming back to time and time again is improving our understanding of, fundamentally understanding what's going on, how people are travelling, moving urgently towards a much better collection of data that goes beyond an annual national travel survey, that does better work does really good work of longitudinal work to understand people's ranges of travel that they might do within a day or within a week, to get to the bottom of some of these and challenge some of these assumptions that people are certain types of users. They are cyclists, or they are motorists, or they are pedestrians, when in fact people frequently mix and match between different trips. It's good that they do, that they have more choice, and it's a resilient and sign of a resilient and strong network to have a lot of options and ways of traveling. So to put some statistics on that, 83% of cyclists also have access to a car. Well, in 2019, people with access to a car did 26% more mileage by rail than those without. So you're getting a sense of, like, some people are high consumers of transport and mobility. And it's not that they always choose between different modes. And my own viewpoint is that it would be great if people had more options and were more fluent in more ways of traveling, partly so they don't in a sort of capability sense, rely upon one thing, but also so psychologically they're not dependent on choosing just one option all the time. Before moving to my closing points, reflecting on applying behavioural science, I'll just nod to the third and final section of the book, which looks at the psychology of when people design transport. And I've talked about some of this already today, that people are inclined to quantify things and substitute metrics that can be measured over the ones that are more difficult to measure. Some of those are sort of necessary simplifications to get a hold of, like, what's going on for millions of people. But there's an inclination to treat that as a more important piece of data. Then what follows from that is that people tend to make averages and aggregate statistics, like the statement, the average person makes 15 cycling trips a day, 15 cycling trips a year. Might very well be that's not an average person. It's many people take 0 trips, and some people take a lot of trips. So that's an abuse of a particular statistic, a mean. But you can see where I'm going with this, that the average sort of representative person might disguise a lot of diversity in needs and behaviours. Then in optimism, and this is more a transport planning point, that it's really hard to plan for innovation with this has huge investment. It's not unique to transport. That's it across lots of infrastructure investment. And then finally, the nature of making decisions in groups and organizations, as transport organizations are big groups, really requires more diversity and more challenge function across the board. So I'll close with some reflections on how are we getting there and how we might rebalance the equation. If we're going to reflect on behavioural sciences and social sciences, I would add to that ability in transport design, we need to first acknowledge that there's a barrier to entry here, that the discipline itself is trying to propose a problem that the sector didn't necessarily know it had, and it therefore has to do a bit more work to make the case to to describe the way in which you're to say to people, hey, this wasn't just a colloquial point. We can put some rigor onto this and show that there is a transport user experience challenge, and this is how much it's costing you in a way, and this is how much better things could be. Secondly, in terms of leadership, there's a challenge in integrating those forms of data that arise from qualitative research or from different forms of quantitative research into the decision-making processes that decision makers are going to have. So at the moment, there are certain benchmarks or criteria that need to be met, and it takes some amount of leadership to understand this from the top and acknowledge and make changes. Thirdly, I think there's an internal challenge within social and behavioral sciences to describe this at first as a perspective or a lens, like a way of looking at things, but then also describing it in terms of a discipline, a set of tools or methods that a social or behavioral scientist does. They go out and they do research or they do analysis, but at some level it needs to be both of those things, that because otherwise it becomes a discipline or a preserve of what will be a tiny fraction of specialists that need to enable people first to understand their methods, but also be able to have it as a way of seeing things as well. In a transport sector space, there are also barriers and challenges of acknowledging there are different types of knowledge. And here I nod to other work, which I had to become familiar with, that there are different levels and understandings of knowledge, like scientific knowledge that we can say are fair generalizations that characterize how people behave when traveling. But then transport's a very applied space. So there's the nature of knowledge that, say, the bus driver would have, or the nature of the experience that the person traveling will have themselves. These can sometimes butt up against each other, and there needs to be some flexibility of saying, appropriate for the circumstances. Some of this is the scientific knowledge, and sometimes it's about skills or crafts within the area, and sometimes about more lived experience. In terms of scale, there's a challenge in behavioral sciences, as I understand it, of scaling, of getting this vast scale from the minutiae of the really small thing, be that a relatively small issue in the scheme of like the entire network of accessibility and connectivity. You know, say littering on public transport. Important, but not the grandest of issues that behavioral scientists sometimes dive into, but small in terms of as well the range of experiments or the ability to do trials in relatively small or either online environments or small trial spaces that are amenable to study. So the really big thorny grand issues of like public transport affordability or the nature of like road safety or social exclusion, and the way that a behavioral scientist can come in with a set of tools that are useful in that domain as well. In my experience applying behavioral science, I think it's worthwhile going from small to big. So within any organization, demonstrating some kind of success, be it running a small trial or experiment, to show some amount of value, and then being able to look at bigger things too. And then finally, the importance of diversity and of culture, like what perspectives are valued within an organization, who gets a seat at the table, who's invited in, what's the nature of valid criticism that they're exposed to, and finally, where people put their money where their mouth is, investing in teams. So from government to local government to academia to especially transport operators, investing in specialists. And that brings me to my final point of where we're getting. I want to take stock of some of the useful reforms that have happened. Firstly, in investment, I wouldn't have been working at the Department for Transport were it not for several stars aligning with respect to people within the organisation valuing psychology, seeing the strength of the behavioural insights approach, of a wider previous sort of government movement towards that kind of discipline and having some frameworks to work with, and ultimately people investing in creating some jobs that are in that domain to build out a relatively small team and to go from there. Within the UK government, there are really significant reforms that have happened at the really important level of the Treasury level on what's called the Green Book, which is the way in which transport impacts are appraised and evaluated. And there's a lot more opening up to not only relying on narrow cost-benefit analysis that would have characterised that utilitarian thing I mentioned right at the start. It's really opening up to like the people case, the strategic case, the way in which you start understanding what people value about, say, natural capital and the value of the environment. So there are really, really good moves that are happening. I challenged myself to write something about STOP, and I think the STOP is the language and framing that behavioural science is used, and there's a big move towards misunderstanding what's meant by behaviour change. Sometimes people within this sector want to call every aspect of travel behaviour change, but there need to be some amount of definitional boundaries that still need to be put around saying, like, is it behaviour change to improve the bus network in a local area, or is that an infrastructure change? Is it behaviour change for people to start to choose differently? Probably, but this language is usually quite top down. The sector has still lent quite heavily on incentives as a way of thinking about whether we give people carrots or sticks or rewards or penalties, when actually there's a wider view that could be done in framing this at a more societal level. And then areas that behavioural science needs to start doing is start widening its scope of interest. And I'd really welcome challenge to the fact that while there are some narrow sort of behavioural science in transport, when we look at something as wide as mobility, there's a need for a sort of model of how people choose how to travel. Other areas of society overlap with transport mobility. So to give some examples, health is a major motivator that someone might want to walk or cycle. Nothing really particularly they might not be motivated about the transport aspect particularly, or the nature of the insurance market overlaps with, say, how they buy insurance for their home, and they're also buying car insurance, or the nature of whether someone has a smartphone or not is going to dictate a lot of how they think about how they have travel options. So the scope of behavioural science within transport is broad, and I hope that I can help do something to help inspire people that might otherwise think transport is quite narrow. It actually encompasses a huge range of areas of education, of geography, of inequality. Really take your pick, and there are the issues within society manifest them in a transport space. So I'll leave it there. And I hope we have just a few more minutes for questions. Thanks for bearing with me, and welcome any response you might have. Thanks very much.
Brilliant. Thanks for that, Pete. And as you just mentioned, we will now take questions. So if anyone does have a question, if you could please raise your digital hand and we will give you the floor, or alternatively, like I said earlier, you can pop your question in the chat and either Pete or I will read that out loud for you. I'm just going to switch the recording off in the meantime. Oh, sorry. So Pete, thank you for your talk. I'll get us going with questions. That was fascinating, and it's really great to have